Some imaginable conspiracies have a self-supporting logical structure. Imagine a conspiracy to make everybody believe that conspiracy theories are always nuts. To what end? So that those who want to look smart will be the first to deny the existence of the conspiracy or any other conspiracy. To make, in other words, every conspiracy invisible by turning its categorical and universal denial into a proud mark of intelligence. But could the conspiracy to make conspiracies sound nuts succeed? It already has.
Get ready for a night filled with conspiracies, strange places, the paranormal, UFOs, legends, and myths from around the world. With your hosts, K-Town and Tim Tanner on Mysterious Radio.
All right. Hello and welcome back to tonight's program. You're listening to your favorite place for all things mysterious. It's Mysterious Radio. I'm your host, K-Town, with my co-host, Tim Tanner. We have a special show for you tonight with none other than Mark Devlin to discuss the amazing conspiracy behind Paul McCartney. This story is truly incredible, and I first actually heard of this, Tim, probably about a few months ago, and I was instantly intrigued. When was the first time you actually heard of this?
I would say probably been a couple of years, but I didn't pay any attention to it. I was like, yeah, okay, whatever, you know. But after researching and reading Mark's book and specifically the chapter on Paul McCartney, I was like, whoa, there's way more to this than I thought. Way more. And, of course, when we started discussing it, it is a very deep rabbit hole once you get started.
The more that you listen to the things that have taken place throughout the years, to me, I believe it. I really do. There's a very, very strong indication that he is not who we think he is. If you have not read it before, the book is actually out and available on Amazon, and it's the memoirs of Billy Shears. Now, this book was written by Billy Shears, whom is claiming that he was Paul McCartney for all these years. It is an amazing book. One that you just will not believe. I mean, this involves the occult.
And the idea of using or sort of letting the Beatles represent this mind control aspect. And if you think about it, that's not really all that far from the truth, because you know that you hear the phrase Beatle craze, or you look back on some of the old videos. Some people may remember it from childhood, but people were really crazy about the Beatles. I mean, like really crazy about them. So it doesn't surprise me there's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories out there about the Beatles, because they were so influential and they were such a big deal that when John Lennon was killed, it was very tragic. And when anything happened, when they changed even the stuff that they wore, it seemed like it affected not just the UK, but over here in America too, once they got pretty global. It's and especially if this guy is basically doing a lifetime role as Paul McCartney, I guess he just couldn't hold it in anymore. You know, he's just got to get it out there.
Right. I mean, so who wants to die knowing that they pulled this off? You know what I mean? They want to tell somebody, and it seems like that's what he's trying to do. So the book is amazing, and it has all kinds of things that are supposed to help you decode the clues that many people have pointed out that are in the album covers and the songs and things that the band members have said throughout the years. Some of them actually caught on tape saying. So it is amazing.
Yeah, and it's really eye-opening too, especially when you talk about all the little secret stuff that they say and the images and stuff, which Mark Devlin also gets into in his book, and very interesting.
Absolutely. So he is an amazing, fascinating guy. We are so lucky to have him before he actually shuts it down to finish his book. And when that happens in 2018, well, he's not going to be available for the entire year of 2017. But when he finishes that book, we will reach back out to him to get him on the show again, definitely. We have something special for faithful listeners catching the show on iTunes. If you take a minute of your time and give our show a rating and review, you will be entered into a drawing to win something very cool directly from us. Go to iTunes, and right there where our podcast is, you hit rating and review, or review. I think there's actually a review button. Hopefully it's 5. And you leave us a nice review.
5.
Yes, please leave 5. That would be very nice. Especially if you're enjoying the show. I mean, that's important because it's helping to give us more visibility so that others can find us. And it also lets us know how much you like the show. And if there's something that you don't like about the show, please let us know that as well. But not on iTunes. You can email us for that.
We are making a huge push to grow this show because the bigger our audience, the more it enables us to get anybody we want. I mean, that's the whole reason you listen to the show, right? For the amazing guests. Please make sure that you help us by going to iTunes and rating us and reviewing us. And we don't care if you have to pause the show right now to go do that. We're not against that. We'll be here when you get back.
Absolutely.
Also, you can get some extra goodies and get access to some shows that will be released only to those who make a pledge to Mysterious Radio through Patreon. You can do that by simply going to the Mysterious Radio website and clicking on the Patreon logo and pledge your chosen amount. Help us reach our goals so that we can travel to different conventions in your area and meet you, which we really look forward to doing. That also helps us with the cost of equipment and hosting the show, which can sometimes be pretty expensive.
Absolutely. Now, coming up next, we have our shout-outs, and then it's business as usual with the amazing Mark Devlin and the whole conspiracy behind Paul McCartney right after this.
All right, we are back for shout-outs, and we do appreciate the love here. For our first shout-out, we've got Jason Scott, who was the first person to pledge to us on Patreon. So, Jason, thank you very much. You are the first and hopefully a line of Patreon pledgers. And from Twitter, we have Jason Jarvis and Ronnie Adams. Thank y'all for showing us some Twitter love and spreading the good radio experience that is Mysterious Radio.
Yes, and Ronnie, I love what you said on your Twitter account, that you're confused in a world of nonsense. I'll feel you on that for sure. Please keep those tweets coming. We do love those. Thank you for all those that take the time to do that. And please slide on over to Facebook and like our Facebook page as well. Now it's what you've been waiting for. We have an amazing show just for you. Mark Devlin is a UK-based club and radio DJ. He is also a music journalist. In recent years, he has begun to speak about the dark forces that have been manipulating and controlling the mainstream music industry for decades. To most people, the music industry represents a source of harmless fun and entertainment. Beneath the glossy veneer, however, lies the devastating truth of who really controls these institutions and the deeply malevolent agendas for which they're being used. Welcome, Mark Devlin. All right, we are so honored to have Mark Devlin joining us on Mysterious Radio. How are you, Mark?
Katina, I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. And Mark, both Tim and I really enjoy listening to the subjects that you discuss, particularly the Paul McCartney conspiracy and mind control. And even though we can't really get into either one of those really deep tonight, I want to give our listeners a serious taste of what this is all about, because it's truly mind-blowing. For any of our listeners that may not be familiar with you, Mark, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what was the catalyst moment that made you start researching these events?
Okay, so I'm a long-standing radio and club DJ out of the UK. So I've done a bunch of radio shows over the years, and I've DJ'd all over Europe and a few countries internationally. And that was my main living. That was my livelihood for about 20 years. And I kind of went along that course without giving it much thought as to what it was I was a part of. Just enjoyed a fairly good living, and did what DJs do. And things got to a point in 2010 where I underwent what I refer to as something of a conscious awakening. And I basically came to some understandings of great truths. And I had lots of questions answered in my mind that had been kind of at the back of it for many years. Big questions such as, what is this place? What is the nature of reality? What are we doing here? What is the purpose of our existence? Where do we go from here? I'm not claiming to have the ultimate answers to all those questions, but certainly some of the answers were revealed to me, I feel, at that time. And it's a process that's available to anyone that has the will to seek out these answers. We're here to learn lessons. We're here to grow spiritually. And it's down to us and our free will as to whether we follow the synchronistic path that's been laid out for us, or whether we choose to resist that and stay steeped in ego consciousness, basically, and, think we know best and go our own way. So I'd reached a point where I had the opportunity to follow this route and expand my consciousness, and I went with it. And my life has not been the same since. And it really feels as if my life is divided into two parts, prior to 2010, everything that happened to me up to that point, and everything that's happened since. And there's no going back when you cross that boundary. You burn certain bridges and you pass the point of no return. And I wouldn't want to go back, to be honest, because I feel that I'm on the path to discovering truth. And I'm doing things in my life now that I would never have believed would be the case a few years ago. And I'm sure it's a process that many of your listeners can relate to, and probably you can yourself. But it's a fascinating thing. So I now find myself as an author and a researcher in the realm of truth, consciousness, conspiracy, mind control, the occult. But within those broad genres, my specialist area of interest is the corporate music industry and how it's used for mass mind control, social engineering, and culture creation. It's a truly colossal subject. It's got many different facets to it. I explore many of these in the book that I put out this year, Musical Truth. We can talk about some of those facets today in the time that we have available to us, but we're just not going to be able to get anywhere near to covering the whole thing because it truly is a massive subject. And what struck me a while back was the area that I'm interested in, the music industry and the entertainment industry broadly, which incorporates Hollywood movies as well, is just one aspect of what's going on generally in this realm of existence. And it's just one play out of the mind control and the culture creation and all the rest of it. It expresses itself in so many other ways. You've got the banking and financial industry and the scam that is money with debt attached, you know. You've got all these false flag terror events that are being foisted on us, all the lies and the manipulation and mind control that goes on in the mainstream news. You've got what's happening in food with GM foods and what's happening with chemtrails and fracking and vaccines and the pharmaceutical industry and all these different facets of the conspiracy, if you want to call it that. And my subject area is just one small part of it. So, you know, for anyone that wants to delve into this whole arena of research, it really is life-changing, and it really can tie you up for hours, days, weeks, months of research. But it's absolutely worth it for anyone that is a genuine truth seeker, because that's why we're here. Why else would we have come?
It is amazing, and I love to hear you talk about it. One thing I would like to discuss with you tonight is Paul McCartney. Many people, and I did come up on this, there's a dentist that's a friend of ours. He's an older gentleman, but he had no clue that this was out here. Okay, he loves Paul McCartney. Many people aren't aware that this notion or of something being off about him spread like wildfire back in the 60s. Can you tell our listeners what that big something is and how the rumor got started?
Sure. Well, let me just tell you a brief anecdote. To make ends meet and pay my bills, I do a job as a private hire driver, basically a taxi driver. So I had someone in the back of the car the other day that was talking about, they were American, and they said, when they get back home to the US, they're going to be attending this big concert, and it's going to be featuring, I think they mentioned Elton John, Tom Jones, and they said, we're going to see Paul McCartney. And I thought to myself, well, you're not. Because he died in 1966, you're going to see an individual that the world thinks of as Paul McCartney, who has been assuming that identity for the past 50 years, but it ain't him. And naturally, when people hear that for the first time, the default reaction is to just throw it out because it sounds so ridiculous and absurd that it can't possibly be true. But when you get on the path to truthful research, you realize that it's a very big mistake to just go with that initial emotional response, that gut reaction, because often the truth of a matter is there to be discovered if only you would put the time and the diligence into doing the research. So for anyone that really wants to get to the bottom of this question and establish whether there's any truth to this widespread rumor, then the evidence and the proofs are all there. And it is a subject that, again, can tie you up for days, months, weeks, years. But it's absolutely fascinating. It's a minefield. And I've thrown myself into research in this area very deeply, as have many other researchers. So it's not just me saying this. You know, I'm picking up on what's been around for a very long time, because it was actually in the United States that the rumor that Paul McCartney actually died, the real James Paul McCartney, in 1966, first surfaced, and it gained pretty widespread prominence towards the end of 1969. It broke in September 1969, and there were a bunch of college kids at various educational establishments in the US, most significantly Michigan University, and then one in Des Moines, Iowa, who believed that they'd stumbled across some visual symbolic clues in the sleeve to the Beatles album Abbey Road. And there were also clues embedded in the famous sleeve to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And some of these students started calling up American college radio DJs and sharing these clues that they discovered. So it wasn't just symbolic pictorial clues in these albums. They also believed that they'd uncovered audio clues in the form of backmasking. So backmasking is where you take a piece of an audio recording and you flip it in reverse, and a message can be hidden in the reverse track, but it's only identifiable to the conscious mind when the piece of music is listened to in reverse. This is actually a tenet of Satanism when you really get into it. It's something that was espoused by the notorious dark occultist Aleister Crowley, and he wrote about it in his various writings, most notably the Book of Magic, where he talked about the adept to these secret society mystery school teachings training themselves to listen to speech backwards and listen to phonograph recordings backwards in order to intuit meaning in hidden messages. So it would appear that this is a tactic that was taken straight from the teachings of Crowley and incorporated into Beatles recordings. It's not just the Beatles that have done it. Many other rock music acts through the years have incorporated backmasking in their recordings. But it was a combination of backmasked messages and these symbolic clues, album sleeves and in photos and stuff that had turned these college kids onto the idea that McCartney had been replaced. And, if you just leave it at that, you could take the view that maybe these kids were smoking something a bit too strong and maybe they just needed to stay a bit grounded and get on with their studies. But, there's far more to it than that. There is a lot of forensic evidence to, in my mind, confirm the fact that the person we think of in the world today is not the real Paul McCartney. So, where do you want to start with it? I should probably mention that there was an article in Wired magazine in Italy, which came out in 2009. And there were a couple of Italian forensic experts who had worked with the police and the judiciary in solving crimes. And, they were very high up and respected in their field. And they'd heard this rumor, which by that point had been around for 40 years, that the real Paul McCartney had died and was replaced. And they set out to debunk this ridiculous idea once and for all because they thought it was, just plain stupid. And within 5 minutes, they could show that it couldn't possibly be the case. So they got a bunch of photographs of the real Paul McCartney from prior to 1966 and what is said to be the fake, the imposter, the replacement, and they compared things like the facial structure and the distance between the eyes and the shape of the jawline and the shape of the mouth and all of this stuff. And they came to the conclusion at the end of their studies that in fact they were looking at two completely different people and this could not possibly be the same man. We also have evidence in the height of McCartney, who prior to 1966 was a reasonably short guy. He was sort of between 5'7" and 5'8", according to reports. And when you saw him on stage with John Lennon sharing a microphone, they were pretty much the same height, or, he was slightly shorter than Lennon. But post-1966, you notice that in pictures of the Beatles, McCartney, in inverted commas, is towering above Lennon and the other Beatles. And actually, after 1966, Lennon and McCartney never shared a microphone again. And this is cited as one of the reasons why the Beatles quit touring in 1966. Their last concert was in Candlestick Park, San Francisco in late August 66. And they never played a live show again together, with the exception of that rooftop jam on the EMI Studios rooftop in London in late 1969. You've also got pictures of the original McCartney with his girlfriend from the 1960s, the actress Jane Asher. And again, they're pretty much the same height in photos prior to 1966. But after 66, McCartney is towering above her. He seems to have gained about 3 inches in height. You could say he's wearing Cuban heels, maybe, but, would that be the case in every single picture? So these are just some of the kind of forensic, fact-based scientific clues, if you like. But there's also a whole bunch of symbolic stuff as well. And we're getting into the realms of dark occult teachings here. As I mentioned, it's the influence of Aleister Crowley and many of the sort of secret societies that he was a part of. And when you do the research and you really get into it, you come to understand that the music industry, like so many other institutions, many of those that I mentioned earlier, the world of banking, the military, the world of science, the world of politics, all these big corporations, are ultimately controlled by networks and groups of dark occultists. So if you think it's all about money and power and corporate greed, you're kind of missing the point. Certainly that plays a part in it, and certainly a lot of what is done with these industries and these institutions is about making a small group of elite controllers very, very rich. But that's not the whole picture. What it comes down to at the end of the day is that we have a dark occult religious priest class presiding over all these walks of life. And They understand the nature of reality, and they understand how to manipulate it for their own means. This would be the main reason why such a small group of individuals have managed to stay on top of society and control and manipulate and dictate the lives of everyone else in this world. So what we see playing out in the music industry is no different to what goes on elsewhere. So I'm just mentioning that as a bit of background to provide some reason as to why all these symbolic clues appeared in these Beatles albums. So the main piece of evidence, if you want to call it that, I would suggest that it is, to confirm the McCartney switch, would be this particular book known as The Memoirs of Billy Shears. It's not a new book. It's a book that came out in 2009, which was the same year that these Italian forensic scientists published their results. It's also the same year that McCartney, in inverted commas, famously appeared on the David Letterman show. And you can get that footage on YouTube. It's a very revealing interview because Letterman actually brings up the subject of the rumour of Paul McCartney having died. So he's, got the guy that claims to be McCartney sitting right next to him. And he says, what about this rumour that surfaced? And McCartney just sort of laughs along with it. And he says, oh, yeah, we had this album called Abbey Road, and these kids got hold of the sleeve and they saw that I was walking barefoot across the zebra crossing in a loosely fitting suit. And they decided that I was dead, because he's barefoot, he's dead. So they kind of laugh it off. And then Letterman says, well, the other part of the rumour is that, there was some guy that took his place and has been playing his part ever since. And McCartney just laughs and says, well, yeah, this is him. I'm him, a very good double. And so, they laugh about it. And then very quickly, McCartney puts his finger up to his lips in a sort of Masonic shush sign, which means, the keeping of a secret, an oath of secrecy. It's a Masonic symbol. So that's a bit of a giveaway there. And this all happened in 2009. So in that year, on the 9th of September, so the date was 999, which if you invert it using the satanic tenet of inversion becomes 666, which is a very interesting and very key number in this whole wide story, and particularly when related to the Beatles and McCartney. Then this book appeared, and the full book was called The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and it was credited to an author, or more accurately an encoder, which is how he describes himself, by the name of Thomas E. U. Harriot. And so the book, which runs to 66 chapters across 666 pages, nice touch, purports to be the autobiography of the individual that took the place of Paul McCartney, spilling the beans and explaining how it was all done. But he can't blatantly come out and say that this definitely is the case and that I'm definitely not Paul McCartney, and put it on the public record like that, because there would be all kinds of legal ramifications and court cases that would ensue as a result of this person basically impersonating a dead man and stealing his identity for the past 50 years. So the book is presented as a work of what was it referred to? Historical fiction. Yeah, it's ostensibly a novel. So what you get from the book is the indication that it's telling the story of what really happened, but there are a few fictional embellishments in there so that the whole thing, if needs be, if ever called upon, could be written off as, a work of fiction, and there's some plausible deniability there. But for anyone reading the book that has any kind of knowledge of Beatles songs, lyrics, what went on in those key years of the 1960s and the inner workings of the band, I think they would agree that there's such a level of inside knowledge displayed in these writings that it has to have come from somebody that was there at that time, that had access to this closely guarded information. It certainly comes across as authentic in that regard. So in the book, the individual who reveals himself to be someone of the name of William Shepherd, nickname Billy Shears. He states that he's descended from a Freemasonic fraternity in Scotland, and that his uncle was a high-ranking 33rd degree Freemason, and that basically he was groomed for this role of taking the place of the original Paul McCartney. And he claims to be descended from William Wallace, who was this Scottish freedom fighter involved in these crusades against the invading English. And this character was played by Mel Gibson in the 1995 movie Braveheart. So William Shepherd, taking the place of McCartney, claims to be a descendant of William Wallace. What doesn't quite add up for me in the book is that, in line with the official conspiracy theory about what happened to the original McCartney, we're told that he was involved in a tragic car accident in which he was outright killed. And according to most reports, you know, he was near decapitated in this hideous automobile accident. What provides a bit of a red flag for me is that of the 365 days in the year of 1966, again, which could be taken to be an interesting number, if you flip the 9 around, you've got another 666, and there were lots of other things happening in the year 1966, which I've detailed in my book on an occultic level. Of the 365 days of the year that it could have happened, the date given for the accident just happens to be the 11th of September. So it's a rendering of 9/11. And these are two more very important numbers in this overall story, again bringing in the workings and the teachings of Aleister Crowley, obviously tying into the massive 9/11 ritual of 2001 that we're all familiar with. But this was an early rendering of the 9 and the 11 and the 66. So the clues are all there in the numbers. You know, Masons and occultists love expressing things in the form of numerology. It's very important to them. It's like a hidden language. It's absorbed by the subconscious of the public when it's put out there, and it has an effect, and that's why they do it. So we're told that this guy, William Shepherd, took the place of McCartney when McCartney just happened to have this tragic accident, which nobody could have foreseen. Nobody knew it was coming, but he was there ready to take the role. And he tells the story that the original Paul had been having these horrific death dreams. He'd been having these kind of precursors to what was going to happen to him in the form of nightmares leading up to that date. And it's almost as if the book is asking you to believe that the young McCartney, who was only 24 when he died, knew that it was coming and that he was kind of prepared for it. And we're asked to believe that this guy, William Shepherd, Billy Shears, who, of course, is introduced to us on the Sgt. Pepper album by name, because in the opening track of the album, this new band that's being presented to us actually say, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." So they're giving him his first public airing. And when you look at the sleeve to that album, you can see that the character playing McCartney stands out over and above all the other Beatles on the sleeve. He's got his back to the camera, whereas all the other Beatles are facing forwards. And, you know, all attention seems to be drawn to him. So it's giving the world their first glimpse of Billy Shears, of this new group, the Beatles Phase 2, and basically telling you what happened for those with the eyes to see. But we're asked to believe that this guy was groomed for the role. So he tells the story that he underwent musical training, that he'd always been a musician anyway. He was an unknown session musician, he says, before taking on the role, and he played in a bunch of other bands as well. Then he had to change his appearance in order to look more like the original McCartney. Obviously, the height is something they could do nothing about unless they wanted to chop his feet off. So they just had to make the best of the rest of it, which involved him undergoing a certain amount of plastic surgery and having fillers injected into his face to make his face look rounder and fatter, because the replacement McCartney, Billy Shears, had a much more oval and longer elongated face than the original Paul. And you can actually see this when you compare photos. For me, it's the main giveaway. You know, the facial structure is totally different. So he had to undergo the change in appearance. He also had to learn how to play the bass left-handed, because he was a right-handed individual, whereas Paul, a bit of a pain in the arse in the circumstances for this guy taking his place, was left-handed. And he tells the story of how he had to retrain himself to play the bass guitar with his left hand and learn to hold his cigarette and his coffee cup and things like that, even though he doesn't appear doing that in some of the pictures, which is another clue. So a huge amount of preparation and training was required to get this guy ready for the role. And among the main objections that deniers of this story come up with is they say, how would it be possible for someone to sound so much like the original McCartney vocally? Well, he answers that by saying that he underwent a certain amount of vocal training, but that he'd always been an actor that had taken on different roles. And it was just part of his nature to assume different identities. And he says, taking on the role of Paul McCartney was just one of those acts. But he also talks about getting into spiritual esoteric realms, the fact that he made a kind of spiritual connection with the soul of the dead McCartney and started channeling some of his abilities through him, that he was, he had that kind of contact with him, and that to a certain extent Paul's abilities and talents were living on through him. So I know that people are going to think that's a bit of a stretch. To be honest, you have to read the book to get the full appreciation of it all. But it certainly seems very compelling for me. And it seems very compelling because of the background research that I've done into the story of the music industry and what really goes on. So I know that symbolism is very important to those that control the industry. I know that they always place clues right there in plain sight. Revelation of the method. They basically tell you what they've done and what they're doing, but they do it in a cryptic, encoded form so that only a few will ever understand what's going on, and the vast majority of the masses will be completely oblivious to it, and they'll laugh it off and scoff at it if anyone tries to talk to them about it. Also, unfortunately, and I wish it was some other way, but ritual sacrifices in line with the belief systems of this religious priest class and the various occult mystery schools that they operate through is a reality. And there are many indicators of the fact that these ritual sacrifices do take place. And I think in this very complex story, we can't dismiss the possibility that that might be what was at play with the demise of the original Paul McCartney.
Can you explain that? Can you go into detail with that, please?
Well, it strikes me as completely implausible that he just happened to die in this car accident and it was just this random thing that was left to chance, and that this individual, William Shepherd, was ready to take his place should he just happen to have a car accident. It seems far more likely to me, and again, many other researchers into this realm, that the original McCartney was taken out deliberately in some way. Obviously, it's difficult, if not impossible, to prove that, but I say it because of all the indicators that are in place in this story. Something has to explain what happened to the original McCartney. It is possible, I guess, that he went into hiding somewhere and has been living out these last few decades in obscurity outside of the public spotlight. But I think it's far more plausible that for some reason and in some way he was taken out and replaced in line with what I suspect to be a very high level Masonic ritual operating through the industry. And again, there are many facets of the entertainment industry that are steeped in this type of activity. That's why I find this quite plausible. So that is the basic background to this particular story. There's lots and lots of fine detail that we can add to it, and maybe you want to go into a few specifics, but that in a nutshell is my take on what has been going on for the last 50 years. And so we've had this individual paraded before us, and because most people in the world alive today have only ever known Billy, Paul as he's known. Another name for him is Paul, as in fake or faux Paul. He is people's understanding and expectation of what Paul McCartney, in inverted commas, looks like. So, you've got to be over 50 years old, closer to 60 years old and above, to have any personal recollection of what the original Paul McCartney looked like. So for most people in the world today, they've just completely accepted Billy as the real deal because he's all they've ever known.
All right, we have Mark Devlin and more on the shocking story of Paul McCartney right after this. Okay, and we're back with Mark Devlin and more on this amazing story.
Mark, now go ahead. You said you had something to add to that. You can go ahead.
I just wanted to add that a lot of people that you speak to about this story, and you suggest that the individual they think of as Paul McCartney is not the real guy, will just scoff at it and laugh it off and just tell you that you're crazy because they couldn't possibly be fooled like that. You know, if this had happened, they would know about it. Well, if anything, I would suggest that this has probably gone on elsewhere as well. And I would suggest that maybe the replacement of Paul McCartney is not the only replacement of a public prominent figure that has taken place through the years. We know that many political leaders around the world have routinely employed doubles to take their place in various situations. And, you know, various celebrities have done that as well. But a couple of stories that are worth bearing in mind are, in the UK, we used to have this children's TV program called Blue Peter back in the 1970s and 80s, and I think it was in the 70s. They used to have this dog that appeared on screen with the presenters. It was just this cozy sort of, you know, family setting. And one time, very suddenly, the dog died after one of the episodes. And being that this was a program for kids, the producers realized that it would be quite traumatic for the viewing audience of children to realize that this poor dog had died. So they went out and got a replacement dog and passed it off as the original. And nobody seemed to notice. Nobody raised any kind of comment about it. And it wasn't until many, many years later that the producers revealed that they'd actually done this, that people realized it had taken place. There's also a television program by the British illusionist Derren Brown, who's a bit of a UK David Blaine, I guess you would say, although he takes things much further. He's all about mind control. He's all about illusion. He's an absolutely fascinating guy, and he understands a lot about how the human psyche works and how to manipulate perceptions of reality. His show has been on mainstream Channel 4 in the UK for many years, but you can also see bits and pieces of it on YouTube. And this particular clip is on YouTube, where, as an experiment, he's in central London. He's standing there in the middle of this busy area with a map, and he stops this person in the street and says, "Oh, can you tell me the way to get to this particular church?" And so this person looks at the map with him and starts to explain. As this is happening, he's got some accomplices, 3 guys that are walking past with a big painting. They're carrying this big painting on their shoulders. And they say, "Oh, excuse me, coming through." And what happens is very, very quickly, Derren Brown jumps behind the picture and takes the place of one of the guys that was holding it. And one of the guys that was holding the picture comes out with a map and takes the place of Derren Brown. Now, the person that was explaining how to get to the church on the map doesn't notice that they're now talking to a different guy. So they do this once. Then Derren Brown says, "Let's see how far we can take this. You know, the guy that I replaced myself with looked a bit like me and had the same body shape and stuff. Let's try it with somebody that's completely different, like a fat, bald guy, you know." So they try the thing again. They replace him with a guy that looks nothing like him. And the person with the map doesn't notice. And then they do it one more time and they switch him with a woman. So the person, you know, given the directions, 1 minute is talking to a man. The next minute, she's talking to a woman. She looks up, says, "There you go then," and walks off and doesn't even seem to notice. Now, we're told this is an authentic exercise. It wasn't a stunt using actors. That's the disclaimer that's always given. And it just goes to show how much the mind misses when it's not expecting to see something there. You know, it fills in blanks. So somebody looking at a picture of the Beatles from 1966 onwards, what do they expect to see? They expect to see John, George, Ringo, and then in the 4th place, they expect to see Paul. So having seen John, George, and Ringo, the mind kind of fills in the blanks. And because you expect to see Paul, that's what you see. Nobody thinks to scrutinize the fine detail of him and compare the facial shape with an earlier photo because you don't expect that anything has taken place. It's just a little indicator of how easy it is to dupe people and how easy it is to manipulate the subconscious mind when the conscious mind is not engaged and is not paying attention to the detail. And I would suggest that's what's been done for the last 50 years with this guy. But, you know, this conspiracy theory, if you want to call it that, is gaining a lot of traction now. So as I said, it reached mainstream popularity and mainstream exposure in the United States in 1969, when all these college kids seemed to spot that something had gone on. And it led to a flurry of newspaper headlines, and it got into Life magazine. They actually sent a reporter out to McCartney's remote Scottish farm to track him down, seemingly as proof that he wasn't dead after all. You know, he was still alive, folks, and here he is, and they presented photographs of him. But they didn't address the suggestion that, you know, the original Paul could have been replaced. So that just kind of fizzled out after 1969, and it remains something that people that were into conspiracies were aware of, but it wasn't really in the mainstream. But in the last few years, with the explosion of truth issues generally and conspiracy issues, you know, people are asking questions about all kinds of things now. 9/11 and all these false flag terror events, all these hoax news stories that we get given, the true nature of banking and money and finance, and the true nature of the so-called elites and depopulation programs, Agenda 21 and the New World Order, all this sort of stuff. So now people are starting to look at all these subjects with fresh eyes, and the McCartney replacement is just one of those. And of course, we now live in the era where we've got the internet and people can do their own research in their own time, at their own leisure. There's a wealth of information at their disposal. They can use discernment to look at a wide, eclectic array of different sites and draw in information and compare it. And that's what people are doing. And 50 years on, it's just incredible to me that people are now in large numbers starting to look at this afresh. And something that they've basically got away with, that the control system have got away with for the past 50 years, is now getting scrutinized in a way that it didn't before. It might have taken 50 years to get there, but, you know, the truth always comes to the surface in the end, so it seems.
Mark, I was wondering, since we started, you mentioned the Masonic groups that and the Masonic symbols that the fake Paul made. What other groups do you think are kind of behind this manipulation and presenting this new Paul to us? And sort of, you know, what would be, what do you think would be their overall end game there?
Well, it would be mind control in its broadest sense. And people have put forward all kinds of suggestions as to why they might have chosen to replace the original Paul. You know, I mean, one suggestion is that they had an agenda set out for the Beatles, which was all about social engineering and the shaping of cultural values and perceptions. And I would absolutely say that is the case. You know, there's a very strong suggestion that the Beatles were a product of British military intelligence, as pretty much all the leading groups of those key years in the 1960s were on both sides of the Atlantic. So you hear the suggestion that the Beatles were a project of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, as were the Rolling Stones. So you've got the two biggest groups of the 1960s that absolutely shaped the culture of that time and became household names, and steered young people off down in a particular direction in terms of the music and the culture that they represented. And they were both coming out of the same, you know, institution, and both basically controlled by the same entities at the end of the day. They were marketed as rivals. So the Beatles, when they first came out, were put out there as these clean-cut, nice lads making pleasant pop songs, you know, these love songs that your granny could get into, whereas the Rolling Stones were marketed as more dangerous and edgy and sort of the bad boy antithesis to the Beatles. But it would certainly appear to be the case that both groups were controlled and were getting their directions from the same, you know, people and groups at the end of the day. And then over in the United States, there's been so much research to show that all the groups that came out of the counterculture hippie scene, this is the work primarily of the author and researcher Dave McGowan. And isn't it interesting, guys, that today we're doing this show, and it's the 22nd of November. So first off, it's the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. So it's a great day to be doing a show about conspiracies, considering that the phrase conspiracy theory was coined by the CIA to discredit people that were asking too many questions about what really happened with the Kennedy assassination. Also, the 22nd of November last year, 2015, was the day on which we lost the great author and researcher Dave McGowan, who sadly passed away. So we're talking about his legacy 1 year on, which I don't think is by accident. So this guy, McGowan, put out his incredible work in the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon to show that all these groups that basically shaped and molded the sound and the scene of counterculture in the 1960s, coming out of Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, all had family connections through the fathers of these musicians going into the worlds of military intelligence and various expressions of the government and the establishment, from the Doors to the Mamas and the Papas to Frank Zappa to the Beach Boys to Joni Mitchell to Joan Baez to who else? Buffalo Springfield, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. All these different groups, Captain Beefheart, so many you could name. You've also got the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead were assets of the CIA, basically. And the tour manager of the Grateful Dead turns out to have been the son of one of the founding members of the Tavistock Institute back in London, which is all about culture creation and social engineering. So, with so many of these groups, you've got evidence that they were not what they seem. There's connections from The Who going back into that world as well. There's a lot of suspect elements to Elvis Presley's background, his links to the world of the military. Also with Cliff Richard, who was marketed as the British Elvis towards the end of the 1950s when he first came through. Lots to know about Cliff Richard. He's been embroiled in suggestions or scandals involving paedophilia, an alleged sexual offence which is said to have taken place in the mid-80s. Also involving Billy Graham, the evangelical, famous preacher. So we're getting into very murky waters here with the worlds of paedophilia and the dark occult, and military intelligence is never far from the surface. Cliff Richard's father worked for Thorn EMI, and EMI, like so many of the record labels that were prominent in the 1960s, those very formative years, was involved in military research. It was involved in electronics work on behalf of the military establishments. It was the same with Decca, Parlophone, RCA, all the big record labels, Capitol, at the time, that were putting these groups out. So you have all these links going back into these worlds. So it's not just that there was something strange or unsettling about the Beatles. It's the case with all these groups and all these artists. And it's the same thing going forward through the ages. So you can take it forward into the 1970s, 80s, all the way up to present day. And these elements are present. And something that I've come to an understanding of pretty much this year in recent times is the fact that anyone that is put out there in the public eye as any sort of cultural icon, any kind of recognizable household name figure, anyone you've heard of, anyone that the average guy in the street would know, whether it's a politician, some other kind of world leader, whether it's a Hollywood actor, whether it's a prominent musician, a television presenter, a sports star, a business leader, a mogul, an oligarch, a royal, anything like that. They've all been selected for that role, and they've all been placed there for the purpose of having an effect on the psyche of the general public and basically mind controlling large numbers of people. That is their primary role, their primary reason for being there. So they hide behind these personas, and we think of them as entertainers or, politicians, whatever it is. But their real role has been given to them behind the scenes by their handlers, by their controllers, and they're referred to as lifetime actors. So we think of them as one thing, but what they're really doing is shaping culture and changing people's values. And a lot of it is down to the debasement of morality. So they're changing people's attitudes towards morals. This is why I always go back to what was done in the 1960s as the best example of social engineering that is designed to debase morality. So you've got this whole hippie counterculture scene where you had the music changing very quickly. You can look at the Beatles' music and how different it was from 1966 going onwards. See, this is another thing tied in with the McCartney story. He tells in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, how when he came into the group, he basically took over. And he said, John Lennon had lost interest in steering the group in any particular direction because he was so distraught at losing his childhood friend Paul. And, Billy William took advantage of this situation and basically steered the group off in a different direction. He says that Sgt. Pepper was his album. You know, he displays supreme ego and arrogance in this book in terms of how he comes across. He basically says Sgt. Pepper was his album, but he didn't mind the other three coming along for the ride.
Wow.
You know, how steeped in ego do you have to be to make a statement like that?
Right.
And then, of course, the Beatles' music became very avant-garde and experimental and quite psychedelic, and it tied in with the arrival of LSD on the scene. So you had LSD coming out of nowhere in both the UK and the US simultaneously, and it was coming through guys like Tim Leary and Ken Kesey in the UK, who seemed to have endless supplies of this stuff, and they were just dishing it out for free to all the kids that were gathering at all these hippie communes and all these music festivals like the Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock and things like that. And then over in the UK, you had the arrival of LSD here as well. Also magic mushrooms and these other psychedelic hallucinogenic compounds. You also had social movements like feminism coming through Gloria Steinem, who was yet another CIA asset. You know, a very common denominator in this story is how many individuals just happen to have come from connections through to the CIA. So you had feminism, you had all these other social movements and all this political unrest with various demonstrations and stuff going on. You had the Vietnam War raging, and you had the Manson murders, of course, in the US as well, which very much traumatized the general public. And over in the UK, you had the Cray twins, who were these gangsters operating out of London, who incidentally had very close ties to a lot of the music characters of the day, particularly Cliff Richard. You know, what kind of link should there possibly be between a supposed Christian singer and these hardcore East End gangsters? Again, we're getting into the world of paedophilia here and all this other ugly stuff that goes on. And links to Jimmy Savile as well. People might be familiar with Jimmy Savile and all the stuff that he got up to, if we're going to be talking about paedophilia in elite ranks. So all these things are interconnected. That's why I say it's such a massive tapestry of information, and it can take so long to really delve into it and get an understanding of it. But, you know, if you want to know what's really going on in the world, if you want to get a grasp on why certain things are done, why are rituals so important, why is placing the symbolism in plain sight so important, what is the true nature of these individuals and these groups that are running everything, that control everyone from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones to the Grateful Dead to anyone else you might care to mention, then, you know, the answers are available to be sought in these incredible times in which we live. You know, truth is coming to the surface now in a way that it never did before. And it's available to be discovered by anyone that has the will to do the research and go where it takes them.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, and I'm wondering about, you know, some of the people that were closest to the biological Paul, even John Lennon. The question I have about John Lennon, first of all, is if his assassination had anything to do with the replacement of Paul, and also Paul's biological family. Did they not come forward and say something about this, or did they just go along with it?
And what he says basically is that the family were Paul's biological family were in on the plot, but he is still sticking to this version of events that nobody actually knew that Paul was going to die. It was this tragic, unforeseen event. I don't buy that at all, and like I say, a lot of other researchers into this realm don't buy it either, because it just implies that everyone was just sitting around and just waiting to see if Paul just happened to die and had an accident, and he did, and nobody knew it was going to happen, which just seems preposterous to me. You know, I think there was high-level complicity on the part of all the parties concerned. And the family obviously were in on it, because there's no way this replacement could have passed himself off as Paul, and his family didn't know about it. So Paul had only one sibling, who was Mike McCartney, known professionally as Mike McGear. And he was part of this other Liverpool group called The Scaffold that came out in the 60s. They had songs like Lily the Pink and stuff like that. There's a very revealing clip of a TV show which is part of the documentary movie The Winged Beetle. And people can get this on YouTube. I would suggest looking at the original Winged Beetle documentary, because there's a 2012 update with different information. but it was produced by somebody other than the individual that put out the original Winged Beetle. So if you go to the original movie, and you can watch it in full on YouTube, there's a clip of a TV show hosted by this guy called Mike Douglas in 1969. And the group scaffold appear on it with Mike McGeer, Paul's biological brother. And the host, Mike Douglas, says to Mike McGeer, "When was the last time you saw your brother?" And this would be in reference to the Paul is dead rumours, which had just broken in the States at that time, in late 1969. And McGeer says, at his funeral. And the host sort of thinks he's joking, and he says again, no, really, when did you last see your brother? And he says again, sort of perfectly serious, at his funeral. So it's little kind of red flags like that, which I find very interesting. When Paul's biological father died in 1976, Paul, in inverted commas, Billy, famously didn't attend his funeral. Instead, he decided to continue his tour with Wings. Wings were on tour at the time, and he didn't feel it necessary to cancel the gigs and attend his father's funeral. That's another strange one. Then you've got all these other little indicators from the other Beatles, where they seem to be trying to let people know that this replacement had taken place. And of course they were in on it, but you can assume that they went along with the plan rather uncomfortably, and that they were kind of forced to do it. They had no choice in the matter. So again, I think this is in the Winged Beetle documentary. You've got this piece of footage from John Lennon's Imagine film from 1971, and you've got John and George Harrison in a kitchen with Yoko Ono making them tea. And John says to the camera, here you've got two of the Fab Four, or here you've got a Beatle wife making tea for two of the Fab Four. And then George jumps in and says, the Fab Three. And then John says, oh yeah, the Fab Three. And then they start talking about Beetle Bill. And he says, oh yeah, Beetle Bill. Beetle Bill's not doing too well these days, is he? And then at the end of that little sequence, Lennon gives a little wink to the camera. Then you've got a scene, a piece of footage where Billy, the McCartney replacement, walks into a room where George Harrison is. And George says to him, hello, William. How are you? And there's also a scene from the movie Give My Regards to Broad Street, which was a Paul McCartney star vehicle movie from 1984. And there's a scene there where the character, McCartney, in inverted commas, walks into a room, and this old guy introduces him, and he says, do you know William? Then you've got a piece of footage from an Australian radio interview where George Harrison starts talking about fall. And again, you can get this footage on YouTube. Everyone can check this stuff out for themselves if they want to scrutinize it. And George makes a couple of references to fall. He says, oh, fall this and fall that. He's not saying Paul. It's pretty obvious that he's saying fall. It's as if he's letting us know what's going on. You've also got this situation with Ringo Starr. Now, there was a story which came out, I think it was probably a couple of years ago, 2014, which purported to be Ringo Starr giving an interview to this publication called The Hollywood Inquirer. And he is supposed to be spilling the beans on what really happened with Paul. And so, according to this story, he admits that the real Paul died in 1966 in a car crash. The Beatles, their management, Brian Epstein, and the other members panicked and thought, oh my God, what are we going to do? We can't tell the public Paul has died because it will be the end of the Beatles, and all these girls will be going hysteric and committing suicide at the loss of their beloved Paul. What are we going to do? We've got to replace him. And so, according to this story, they found this guy who was the winner of a Paul McCartney lookalike contest, and he agreed to step into the role and play the part of Paul, initially for a temporary period. But Ringo says, well, nobody seemed to notice and we were getting away with it, so we decided to give him the full-time job, and he just continued, and it's been going on to this day. Now, the problem with this story is that it was a hoax. It was fake. The Hollywood Inquirer doesn't actually exist, and it would appear to be a satirical kind of spoof story. But you've got to ask yourself why anyone would bother putting out a spoof such as that, if not to throw people off the track of genuine research into this area, and to make, serious researchers look a bit stupid. Because people that don't delve into any fine detail will hear that it was a hoax and go, oh, well, the whole thing is just stupid then, isn't it? You know, there's no foundation to it at all. Because there was another movie, again, which people can watch on YouTube, called The Last Testament of George Harrison. This one purported to be George in his sickbed in hospital a couple of days after he was stabbed almost to death when an intruder broke into his country house in Henley-on-Thames just before New Year's Eve in 1999. He was badly attacked. So he ended up in hospital, and this movie claims to have been based on a series of tapes that he recorded where he, like Ringo, was admitting to the replacement of Paul and spilling the beans and explaining how it was all done. I mean, this is such a badly done hoax, and it's so obvious that it's somebody's idea of a sick joke that, you know, it amazes me if anyone's taken in by it. So we've got another spoof, which is all over the internet. And again, you've got to ask yourself, what would be the value in certain parties investing the time and the energy to put a spoof like this out? What is worth bearing in mind is that although that Ringo story from the Hollywood Inquirer was a hoax, there is a genuine interview with Ringo Starr from the UK's Daily Mail in 2011, where he says in the interview twice, "I'm the last remaining Beatle." There's one quote where he says, "People think it's Paul, but it's not. It's me. I'm the last remaining Beatle," as if to emphasize the point, you know. So it's not as if we haven't been given a wealth of clues through the years to let us know what's going on. And of course, the family would have had to have been in on it. The other Beatles clearly would have had to have been in on it. There are people that think the assassination of John Lennon may in some way have been linked to his knowledge of McCartney being replaced. Same thing with George Harrison. You know, it would appear to be the case that when he was so badly stabbed up in his home, presumably the intention was for him to have been killed. And, you know, it's a bit of a miracle that he survived, and it wasn't in the plan that he would survive. So George lived for another 2 years. He died in 2001 of cancer in the end at the age of 58, but he survived that attack. So some people think it may have been an attempt to take him out in terms of knowledge that he had about it. There's a couple of other interesting things for people to consider as well while we're talking about footage that's available on YouTube. There's a famous piece which is McCartney, Billy's reaction to the news of the death of John Lennon. So if you just type that into YouTube, Paul McCartney reacts to John Lennon's death, these reporters catch him coming out of a recording studio in London when the news had just broken about John's murder. And they say, well, you know, what do you think? What's your reaction? And McCartney is very nonchalantly chewing gum. And the only thing he can say is, yeah, it's a drag. It's a drag, isn't it? Good night. See ya. He just walks off.
Oh, goodness.
So, you know, this is your childhood friend with whom you've made history and out of it impacted people around the world. And he's just been horrifically murdered in cold blood. And the only thing you can say is it's a drag. And people say, well, you know, we react to grief in different ways and none of us really know what we'd be like in those circumstances. But that just doesn't seem genuine to me. That is a red flag. And then you've also got a piece of footage of when McCartney was stopped by reporters driving up this country lane in his Land Rover, and these reporters meet him and they say, Paul, you know, what do you think of the news of George's death? This is in the wake of George's eventual demise. And again, he just seems very detached from the whole thing. And you get the impression that he didn't really want to speak to these reporters anyway, but he realizes that he's got to keep up the pretense. And he just says, oh, yeah, you know, it's a shame, it's tragic, and we go back such a long way. But you don't get the feeling that he's genuine. You don't get the feeling there's any real attachment there. And one thing that comes through in the tone of the writing in this book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, is the supreme ego and arrogance of this guy. You know, as I said, he just takes credit for having made the Beatles great. He says that he was far more talented than the original Paul. And he says that John didn't know what to do with the Beatles and he wasn't taking the group anywhere. And it's only when he came in that the group achieved their greatest success and made their most interesting songs. And basically the Beatles was his project. So this individual just seems absolutely steeped in ego. And, you know, you speak to a lot of people and their impression of Paul McCartney, in inverted commas, is that he's a bit of a, I don't know if we can swear on this show, but, you know, a bit of a fool, let's say. I'm thinking of a word that begins with A.
You can say
and ends in E. Here's another piece that people might want to look at as well. We mentioned David Blaine earlier, and there was a point where David Blaine was doing this stunt in London in, I think it was 2003, and he was suspending himself in this glass box over the Thames via a crane for several days. So it was an endurance stunt to see how long he could, stand to do it. And there were onlookers that were gathering underneath every night that had come to have a look at this crazy stunt. And one evening, these reporters spotted Paul McCartney in the crowd, and they said, that's Paul McCartney. My God, let's go over and have a word with him, So all these photographers ran over to him, and witnesses that were on the scene said that he appeared drunk and that he was very hostile towards the reporters and the crowd. And he basically said, F off. I'm a pedestrian on a private visit, and I've just come down here to have a look at this stupid sea. So, and then he apparently went to punch a photographer, told the crowd to F off, and ordered his driver to take him home, and then promptly fired one of his staff. So, this seems to be the real character that we're dealing with here. And it doesn't seem to be compatible with this wonderful, lovely, lovable guy that everyone thinks of as Paul McCartney. It's just red flags. It's red flags galore for me. So many unexplained things. But if you accept that this replacement took place, then all these things that appear to be anomalies and discrepancies and unexplained things suddenly are explained and suddenly fall into place, because you're dealing with a lifetime actor. You're dealing with somebody that's taken the place of somebody else and has been carrying this burden. They've undergone plastic surgery. They've changed their appearance. They've given up their previous identity, and they can never go back to it for the rest of their days. There would be a huge amount of pressure involved in playing a role like that. And I think we're seeing aspects of it coming out. And also, have you noticed, if you look at recent pictures of Billy 4, he says in the book that he's 5 years older than the original McCartney. So assuming that's not one of the fictional embellishments and he's telling the truth, that means he was born in 1937, because Paul's birth date is 18th of June 1942. So if Billy was born in 1937, he's 79 years of age now. He's 80 next year. And if you look at recent photos of him, he's started to become very saggy. His face just is full of droopy sagginess. And a lot of people will say, well, it's just age. It happens to people with age. But for me, it seems to be entirely consistent with somebody that's had a lifetime of plastic surgery. And he says in the book that he's had fillers injected into his face to kind of bulk it out, So presumably after a few decades, all that stuff is going to start to sag and droop. And, I think we're starting to see that manifesting now in current pictures of him.
Definitely, with the sagging face and everything, it's very prevalent now. I was wondering also, to kind of come back to actually you've talked quite a bit about it, but I just kind of wanted to see if your take on who it was who might have put the clues in the music, like the album covers, and who decided to do that. Was it something the Beatles created, or was there some sort of outside entity specifically that had something to do with that?
I would say that it's a central tenet of the belief system of those that control the Beatles and the corporate music industry generally, and all these other walks of life, that they have to tell us what they're doing. They have to give us an opportunity to know the truth of a matter. So when the Beatles were asked about all these backwards messages that kids thought they had uncovered in the recordings, they would always deny it. So there's interviews with John Lennon where he says, oh, that's just stupid. There's these things such as at the end of Strawberry Fields, when you listen to the play out of the track, you're supposed to be able to hear under the mix of the music John saying, I buried Paul. And when he was asked about that, he said he was saying cranberry sauce for no apparent reason. And then another version that's given of it is he was saying, I'm very bored. So when they were directly challenged about these things, they would deny it to the conscious mind. And yet the symbolism and the backmasking is aimed directly at the subconscious mind, where it can be properly absorbed and worked into the psyche of the individual that's receiving it. And this is what we see going on in the world all the time. So if you turn on a mainstream news bulletin, the average CNN or Fox program or BBC or whatever, I think we all know that what you're watching is establishment propaganda and blatant lies, provable lies. So they're lying to the conscious mind. Your conscious mind is engaged when you're listening to what the newscaster is telling you, and they're telling you lies. But when you go and watch a Hollywood movie or a music video or a stage show such as the US Super Bowl or the Grammys or something like that, or even a cartoon like The Simpsons or Family Guy, you often find that there are great truths encoded into those works of apparent imagination, apparent fiction, apparent fantasy that are actually telling you the truth of what's going on. And that's being absorbed by the subconscious mind, which is where symbolism lives. So you've got this absurd, upside down, inverted scenario in this world where we're being lied to the conscious mind, but the truth is being told to the subconscious mind, for those that know how to interpret the symbolism and learn how to pay attention to what's being conveyed to it. This is how predictive programming works, which is where you get depictions of things that are planned to be unfolded in the months and years ahead. And we're given little tasters and little forewarnings of what's going to come in movies, music videos, TV shows, etc. 9/11 is the classic example. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples of the events that we were asked to believe by the mainstream news on the 11th of September 2001 in the years and the decades leading up to it. But it's not just 9/11, pretty much everything, the Boston bombings, the Sandy Hook incident, any kind of shooting or so-called terror event, you can find some depiction of the mainstream version of events which had been encoded into movies, videos, etc., that people would have watched in the run-up to it. So it's making a connection in the subconscious mind between the official narrative of the story and what people have seen in these works of apparent fiction. And it's getting you ready and establishing a familiarity with the official narrative so that when the newscaster comes on and says this is what's happened, the subconscious mind is prepared for it because it's already absorbed certain, renderings of that story. Also, people are making an energetic connection with the scenarios that are manifesting. And when you understand how energy works and our consciousness can actually affect the physical outcomes that we experience when it's harnessed in the right way, a lot of these events are massive energetic rituals where they're trawling the energy and vampiring the energy off of large numbers of people by way of their concentrated consciousness. And it's helping to empower these events into place. But I would say the main reason why predictive programming is done, and it would also apply to subliminal messages in audio recordings and clues, such as the clues that we saw pertaining to the replacement of Paul on albums such as Sgt. Pepper, Abbey Road, Let It Be, and so many others, is because the controllers, the powers that be, the occultists, the priest class that are presiding over all these different walks of life, as part of their belief system, they have to give us the opportunity to know what they're doing. And as I say, they do it in encoded cryptic form, using symbols, using numerology, so as to obfuscate the detail of the thing. And they know that it's going to go straight over the head, or it's going to miss the conscious mind, we could say, of the vast majority of people watching it. But it doesn't take away from the fact that there's the opportunity to know for those that have the time and the energy and the motivation to look into it and properly understand what's being done. So I would say that's why they put all these clues pertaining to Paul is Dead into so many of these Beatles works. And it's all over the tracks that came out post 1966. When you read the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and if you accept that this is the truthful part of the book, the writer breaks down the true meaning of the lyrics of so many Beatles records that you think are about one thing, but they're actually telling you the story of how Paul died and came to be replaced, particularly the song Lady Madonna. But it's right there in Hey Jude, it's right there in The Long and Winding Road, it's right there in Let It Be, it's right there in so many Beatles tracks, and even Wings tracks. You know, he even breaks down in the book the meaning of a lyric in Band on the Run, famous Wings track, where you get the lyric, the jailer man and Sailor Sam will search forevermore for the band on the run. And it's broken down in the book